What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you are listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast. That's right. It's the podcast where we bring you the most zesty, flavorful, ideological ingredients so it can blow up your earbuds and you can brew your own faith. Today on the podcast, you're getting a little treaty treat because one of your request elders of the podcast has come true. I have been asked by multiple podcast listeners. They say, Trip, can you have James Evans on the podcast? And I mean, like, do you mean the James Evans? Like, author of We Have Been Believers, James Evans? Like, amazing theologian, like African American Systematic Theology, like, guru of all awesomeness? And then they're like, yes, Trip, that's what we want on Homebrewed Christianity. Well, I too want. I am actually just finished teaching that book here at the Hatchery in Los Angeles, where I'm director of theology and humanities. Like, I loved reading it the first time, loved teaching it this year, and I'm like, yes. But I'm like, how is this going to happen? I put it out on the Twitterverse, and the one and the very only Callid Keefe-Perry, he's like, Trip, James Evans, we're bros, dude. I got this. I'm going to go talk to him, going to interview him. You're going to bring it back to the podcast, and the Homebrew Deacons are going to tell me you're welcome for getting it done. So, Callid, I just want to say thank you. James Evans, I want to say that next time you're on the podcast, I want to interview you because, like, he has some really amazing questions and stuff, but, like, I just finished going through the text with some amazing students, and now I got all their questions and all the ones I was going to ask. So I feel like this is just the beginning. All right, deacons. All right, so before we jump into that podcast, conversation of excellence. They're going to talk about African American theology, talk about doctrine of God, how you do black theology in America. I mean, it's just, it's going to be good. I want to tell you a few things that are headed your way. The month of May for Homebrew is just kind of crazy. Like, I looked at the list and realized all that's going on. You know why? Well, on the month of May, we have a host of opportunities. First, May 2nd, we're having a deacons meeting. What's that, you may say? The deacons meeting. It is an interactive, participatory series of high-action interviews that we're hosting. Tony Jones and I are going to be doing it. And we're going to be rocking through a whole host of interviews. Jeff Pugh will be on there, and we'll do, like, in 30 minutes, an intense fire back and forth. I told him, like, look, you need to tell us 5 good reasons we should be Hauerwasians, and Tony and I can argue with you. He's like, whoa. And I'm like, no, we need you to explain the Hauerwasian Mafia. So that may or may not happen. Helene Russell's coming on, and she's like, look, I'm going to tell you the 6 most amazing ways to be a Christian existentialist. She's an existentialist theologian, and she's going to bring it. She's going to explain it to us. We'll interact about it. And then Bill Leonard's going to be on the podcast, church historian. That's right. He's going to be joining that deacons meeting, and he's going to be like, look, here are 5 lessons from the history of the church around religion and politics, church and state stuff that you might want to have in your head, might have in your sermon reference bank, theological pipe, per se, during this election season. And that's going to be amazing. The 4th segment of the deacons meeting will be an intense battle. Au contraire, mon frere style, with Tony Jones. The thing is, all the members of the Homebrewed community, right, if you want to find out more, go to homebrewedcommunity.com. We'll be submitting the topics for TJ, Tony Jones, and I to battle it out. We don't know what the topic is, but we'll take turns picking a position, and the other one disagrees. That's on the 2nd. And then on the 3rd of May, we have the live podcast battle, the Demon Cast. Yeah, me versus Luke with his... what's the name of his podcast? Luke. His last name's Norsworthy, and the name's not that newsworthy, but we're going to have a podcast battle. N.T. Wright, Greg Boyd's going to be there. Richard Beck on a Malibu roof on May 3rd. It's sold out. Sorry, but it'll be on the internet later. Then on the 10th of May, that's a Tuesday. Monica Coleman and I, that's right, womanist process theologian Monica Coleman, who we're going to have a live webinar. You can sign up for, join for free, on process theology. It's actually like 5 extremely zesty reasons everyone should go process. That's the subtitle. So I'm just saying, if you're interested and you want to know more about basic process stuff, it's a great way to check it out. We'll also tell you about some really cool things that are going to happen this summer, like the Summer Process Institute, where you could take a class with me or Monica or John Cobb right from your living room, digitized right up in your piece. You know, like you're at your screen. You don't have to go driving out anywhere. You can take it. And for some reason, if you already are taking Monica and John's class, then why would anyone not take John Cobb's class this summer? It could be like the last time. Like, I mean, once you pass 92, like every year, just sheer grace. And he's like got a brain just kicking and thumping and junk. And you can take a class with him from your living room. Or you can come out to California. But I'm just saying, don't miss that opportunity. You'll find out about it then. On the 12th of May is the Last Days in the Desert, like, movie kickoff. That's right, the Last Days in the Desert, where Ewan McGregor is playing Jesus in the desert during the, that whole temptation thing. On the 12th, this is the day before it really comes out, there's a whole host of screeners across the country, like Austin, Chicago, Colorado Springs, Columbia, South Carolina, Dallas, Denver, Edina, I guess that's because that's where Tony lives, but it's Minneapolis area, Vegas, that's Nashville, Pasadena, Phoenix, Portland, Rockford, Illinois, San Diego, Seattle, Waco, West LA. Anyway, at all those places, it's not just like you get to watch a movie, but like Gungor's going to do some music and junk. Science Mike, he's going to be like talking to the director and things. It's a interactive experience with the movie. So, yeah, you should think about it. And also know, like, go to lastdaysinthedesert.com and then you can find out, like, how to get tickets, because you have to get tickets in advance on the 12th for that excitement. And I just want you to know, I'm pretty excited about it. Barry Taylor and I been talking about, we're going to Godcast that. That's right, our new podcast, The Story of Godcast. We're going to talk about Jesus in films for an episode, and then we're going to bring the heat and talk about this particular one, Last Days in the Desert. So you should go, if for no other reason, than to be able to fully enjoy our conversation about the movie. Like, and at some point during it, when Obi-Wan Kenobi is playing Jesus, there's a high chance that if you were in youth group about the time I was and were a Star Wars fan, you'll have a liminal moment where you say to yourself, is that Jesus or is that Obi-Wan? If you're older than me and a little angsty, you might have like a Dead Poets Society flashback. You can listen to that. Or, anyway, so that's on the 12th. On the 16th of May is the Epic Reads Introduction to Alfred North Whitehead. If you're a member of the Homebrewed community, that's right, on the 16th, Intro to Whitehead. Put it on your calendar. Boom, shakalaka, laka, laka. But for now, enough with the dating. It is time for you to introduce yourselves to Callid and Dr. Evans as they blow your theological mind. Thanks, Callid. Thanks, Dr. Evans. Remember, if you enjoy this, head on over to homebrewedchristianity.com. Make sure you subscribe, rate, review, and all that junk. But most importantly, make sure you go get We Have Been Believers by James Evans. If you don't have it, get the text. Read it. It's awesome.
Our age presents unprecedented spiritual challenges and opportunities. The next generation of faith leaders need innovation and courage to constructively engage these challenges and opportunities. This innovation and courage is built into how the Drew Theological School trains leaders, scholars, activists, and pastors. Through studies in one of the 6 degree programs offered at the Drew Theological School, you will grow into a next generation faith leader by engaging in innovative theological inquiry and the courageous pursuit of justice. To apply for one of these 6 degree programs at the Drew Theological School, visit their website at www.drew.edu/theological or contact their admissions office at 973-408-3111.
Terrifically grateful today to have Dr. James Evans on the show. The book is We Have Been Believers, an African American Systematic Theology. And if you don't know the text, it is the text on this topic. It's been reissued in 2012. It's the 2nd edition. And it's a shame we haven't had him on the show before. This is a pivotal book in American black theology, and probably, I mean, I can say this, I think, but probably the preeminent systematician in this stuff. And so we're really grateful to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Now, the place I want to start, which I think is really important, is actually the first edition. And for listeners, the second edition does a really good job of framing that. I was really thrilled. And I'm wondering if we could hear from you a little bit. The context in which you were starting to write the book is so radically different in some ways than the contemporary state of black theology.
Yes.
To hear a little bit from you about kind of what was going on for you that you felt you wanted to do this black systematic to start with.
Okay. Well, I think when I got the inspiration for the book back in the early 90s, the reason that I got the inspiration from it was I had been teaching black theology for about 10 years. I had been using James Cone's book, A Black Theology of Liberation, which at that point was 20 years old.
Yeah.
And I said we needed something updated. And I was complaining to my publisher, who responded to me, then write it. So that's really how it kind of got started. I had no answer for him. So I started to sit down and to write this. Now, there are a couple of things I would certainly want the listeners to know, and that is that the writing of this book represented a kind of my entry to an ongoing struggle and query about whether or not the whole idea of a systematic theology was something that was suitable for the expression of African American religious experience.
Yeah.
And we had these internal conversations about whether or not we should even try doing systematic theology, or whether systematic theology itself was something so hopelessly Eurocentric that
the form itself
was that we could never really do it.
And who were your conversation partners in those?
Well,
academics or church folk or both?
Academics who felt that we should use other sorts of methodologies, like cultural anthropology, phenomenology, various forms of literary criticism, and so forth. And my argument was, all methodologies are in some degree rooted.
Yeah.
I think you have to acknowledge, however, that these methodologies have cultural roots. The second thing you have to acknowledge is that they're methodologies, that they don't have the content. They are the tools by which we get at the content.
Yeah.
So I was really fundamentally convinced that that the essence of African American religious experience could be expressed in ways that showed its inner logic, and that would, one, be helpful for students, and two, would be helpful for ordinary Christians in understanding how what we say about Jesus is related to what we say about God, which is related to what we say about the church and about the Holy Spirit. So I was very much convinced by that. And you didn't
have that many models, right? I mean, you didn't really have anything to go off of.
Not only did I not have any models, but I will share with your audience this. I did not, outside of students, I did not get much reaction from my colleagues in the field.
Interesting.
To date, this book has been out over 20 years.
Yeah.
As far as I know, there's never been a Festschrift or a session at AAR devoted to the text. I've had other colleagues who have published and they have devoted. And I remember asking someone, why is that the case? And I'll give your listeners a hint of why I think it's the case. Because it requires that you take a risk. Because you move from the descriptive to the normative. And the minute you move from the descriptive task to the normative task, you put yourself out there. You make a statement and a proclamation. It would be safer for me to simply be a historian of black church experience. It would be safer for me to be a sociologist of black church experience. But for me to actually posit some normative content to African American religious experience, one kind of invites to some degree some critique. At least I thought it would. But I don't think that in the guild, it did not generate the kind of reaction, discussion. But every time I met a graduate student, every time I met one, they would tell me how much this book really helped them.
Well, and I think that's indicative too that even, it's still the book.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I don't mean this insulting at all, but 25 years, there should be another book by now.
Should be.
But
yeah. Right. Should be.
In the course of the academic work.
I would welcome it.
Right.
Should be. But, I think there's still a kind of reticence to take the risk. That systematic task. It is so much safer to be in a descriptive mode. Because once you step out there in a normative mode, you are claiming kind of authority for that religious experience.
Right.
And I think is really what we need to do. So in the middle, the systematic task, we have not had much of it. James Cone did his in 1970. I did mine in early 1990. We still haven't had much. We've had a lot of stuff in the descriptive area of theological study for African American religious experience, and we've had a good deal in the practical area.
Right.
I've even written some about the practical.
Like Dr. Andrews.
Yes, with Dr. Andrews. I've helped with that book, but it's really odd that you have. So in one sense, I feel very fortunate that just as a theologian, that I've got something that's remained in print for more than 20 years. So, I mean, I have to feel very fortunate. And I have to thank my colleague, my younger colleague, Stephen Ray, whose idea it was to come up and redo a second edition. But I think, for me, I've discovered that by focusing in on the particularity of African American religious experience, that through it has been able to connect to the inner logic of other forms of Christian expression.
Right. Yeah. And I think actually this is a really important point because I think, my experience with folks, both within the academy and also kind of just interested clergy and or lay folk, is that when they hear systematic theology, I think part of what they're hearing is a kind of rigidity that's kind of a straw argument that no systematic really is. Right. I'm thinking about the fact that, like, in the preface to even like something like Tillich's Volume 1, he says before he even starts, this isn't done. It's not right. This is the best we can do.
Right.
But the vision that people have of what a systematic is a proclamation of like an ultimate received reality. And that's not really the practice. No one who's trained in that field thinks that's really very, very few people who would call themselves a systematician think they're producing something once and forever.
Well, and that vision, that view of systematic theology is a 19th century view of systematic theology. And there were those like Augustus Hopkins Strong, the Warfields, the Princeton group, who thought they were uttering a kind of timeless truth.
Yeah.
I think after Barth, we know that there's no such thing. That every truth is temporal to its core. Yeah. And when we honor that temporality, then we get at the truth of it. Yeah. So,
and I want to just say that, and your temporality then becomes a bodied one too. It's not just a moment; it's a moment and a people.
Right.
Yeah.
It becomes that space and time embodied in people who occupy that particular space and time. And it's interesting you should mention that. One of the things that I tell people about writing the book for the first time was that as I wrote the book, I had before me in my sanctified imagination, if we call it that, I had before me the saints of the church that my father pastored. And as I wrote each chapter, I conferred with them as to whether or not I got it right. And so it was a conversation with past, with my own past, my embodied past, the past of people, because I was not writing what I thought. I was writing what they believed.
Right.
So that's where the title of the book comes. We have been believers. This wasn't about what I thought.
Right.
It was really about what they believed. I tried to reflect a view of Jesus that would square with their understanding. Of who Jesus is.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really interesting to hear the kind of the process of it, because the thing that makes me think of is that not having been kind of trained as a systematician, I don't know if this is true for everyone, but I think some people think about systematics being established in a kind of mechanical way. Okay, well, once I have my kind of doctrine of scripture figured out, well, then I'll move on to doctrine of creation. But that's the opposite. You're saying, no, you're going to come out of the church. Yeah. Come out of experience and then map it onto what we call the doctrines. You're not assembling a machine.
No, you're not. The doctrines, and I was looking at some notes that I wrote many years ago. The doctrines are answers to questions. That's what they are. I mean, we generally have 5 of them, but some people have more, but they are answers to questions. And so you must acknowledge where the questions come from. And to me, when systematic theology fails, it fails because it refuses to acknowledge where the questions come from. Whose question am I trying to answer? So when I could pick up a book, which I did, and this was many years ago, written by a South African theologian at the height of apartheid, and he never mentions apartheid.
Something's up, right?
You have not listened to people because your whole reality is shaped by this political environment. And your understanding of God, Christ Church is shaped by that. So we have to understand whose questions are we trying to answer.
It's interesting. Something you taught me years ago that I still teach and I've preached on is that, and I think it's related to this. You said to me once, if every time you open the Bible, you know what you're going to find there and you find it, you're reading the Bible wrong.
You're right.
That our theologies and the way we read Scripture needs to keep sharpening us and pushing us, not just confirming what we already think.
Absolutely. Because if it isn't that, then it is not an inspired text. It's not a living text. It's really a dead text then. Every time we open it, we're going to read the same thing. We're going to come to the same conclusion. Then it really doesn't have any power or authority.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So, I mean, we kind of have been talking around it yet, but I want to kind of move into some of the particulars of the actual arguments in there. So, in form, you have in this book laid out a classic systematic.
Right.
One of the things, though, that I think is really interesting is you can't help but pick up this book and read any of the chapters on any of the particular doctrines and understand that you're establishing this systematic for the black church. And so the question would be, what is the relationship between the theological framework established in We Have Been Believers and the church universal? Can you make a comparison there? What's it for? If you're not part of the black church experience, what's to be done in reading this text?
Well, that's a good question. And that had a lot to do with the way I organized the text. I organized with students in mind first. And so I wanted to, if a student had this text before them, and they had the text of any other systematic theologian, they should be able to read the doctrine of God in this text, the doctrine of God in that text, read them and let them speak to each other. Ask yourself, okay, what's the beginning question for this theologian here, whether it's Dan Migliore or what's the beginning question? And so it was meant to be read in conversation with others. And to me, that's where the meaning comes out.
So it's already kind of dialogical, just in your intent for it.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. As opposed to somebody who could conceive of their work as self-standing. Read my work, get what I'm doing.
Right.
You said, no, you read my work in comparison with.
Right. And I said that to my students. I said, so when somebody gives you, the doctrine of God from some other theologian, then you will be able to find the chapter on God in my book. And that's why it's one of the reasons it's organized that way. It's meant to be taught in a systematic theology course.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a couple places that I want to kind of bop in because it seems to me that you've done something kind of particularly novel or powerful. One of the first pieces I wanted to kind of focus on is your insistence that the way that the black church understands the Godhead is as ungiven.
Right.
And I think, so first of all, I get to talk a little bit about that. And then second of all, I think that is for a lot of people counterintuitive, right? Because as the people say, no, the black church has a profoundly personal relationship with Jesus. And you're not denying that, but you're also saying, but the character or the quality of God is ungiven. So how do those things mesh for you?
Well, it relates to something we were speaking about earlier. The notion of the ungiven God really has a couple of roots. I talk about it. One comes out of traditional African experience, where God is seen as kind of wholly other, that we don't control God. See, God is not a given in the sense that we can always be sure that what God is saying is what we're hearing.
Right.
Okay. Luther talked about it in his own way, from a somewhat different experience. But for God to be God, we have to understand that God is not us. There has to be this element of ungivenness. If we believe that God is totally within our grasp or within our control, then that's not God, that's us. And so when I talk about that, we're talking about God as experienced. Not God as an abstract concept. So we could go to Aristotle and others and have a view of God that if it doesn't fit within the confines of my own rational compartments, then it's not really God. But I'm talking about the way people experience God. In the African American experience, people experience God as both radically present and at other times radically absent.
Right.
Okay. And so we have to take that into account. And if you do not do that, you really distort the experience of most African American Christians. That's one of the problems with the so-called prosperity gospel now, is that it points a picture of God that we control, that God is at our service. And it does not provide an answer for people who experience moments of the radical absence of God.
Right. Yeah, and that makes it hard, right? So if we can pray hard enough and kind of get that, then why do we still have racism? Right.
That's right. And so that experience of both absence and radical presence of God reinforces each other in a way that really brings dynamism and makes God big enough.
Yeah. You don't really try to hide the fact that you really do think that the doctrinal kind of the wielding of the doctrines, but specifically the doctrine of God, is always done for a purpose. It's not just because you're trying to really get how God is.
Right.
It's for a people, for a time.
Right.
And that the kind of, you call it the humanocentrism and or the theocentrism of the doctrine of God is at certain times. At certain times you need to be able to say, kind of especially during slavery, but also Jim Crow, God is not here right now because the stuff you're preaching at me, white preacher, is wrong and off. And I need God to be absent from this because otherwise I'm supposed to be being whipped.
That's right.
And I think that's hard for some people to understand. Well, isn't God always supposed to be a certain way? And then you say, we're talking about the experience of God.
Talking about the experience, right.
And you, that's sufficient for you to do that doctrinal
At the end
work.
of the day, it's all that we have. I mean, and I say that the only God that we know is the one we meet in our experience. And so,
but some of your colleagues would challenge that. I mean, and you know that.
They would because they say you can't confine God to our experience. And I'm not saying that God is confined by our experience.
Right.
But to this day, I don't know of any other way for me to authentically encounter God.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, I know it talks about the rationality but still, it's through some you can teach me about God all you want to. But until I have some kind of experiential encounter, it is not going to mean anything.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. So this slides well into kind of another piece that I think is really interesting. So the way that you frame ecclesiology then is interesting because you say it's just the church, regardless of which account of the inception of the church you take, whether it's Peter, whichever one you take. The thing that's being framed in the kind of the ecclesia and black theology is an individual relationship, but then also the individual relationship with the neighbor.
Right.
That it's not just the church as an abstract entity. It's about relationality at its core.
Right.
That's what the ecclesia is in the Black church.
Yeah, and I think that's that's what all these sort of three sources of ecclesiology that we find in theology, whether it comes as an expression of the synagogue of ancient Israel, whether as they do in sort of Petrine ministry, whether it's bound by this confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi, or in Pentecostal traditions, whether it's something that happens in the book of Acts and in that encounter. In all of those, the attempt is the same, this creation of community. These are three different ways in which modalities for the creation of community. Yeah. And so, I don't, that's why I understand that one has to embrace the traditional modalities of ecclesiology through which we all come to understand and know God. But we have to understand that it is a modality. It is not the only way that people can come to know God, even though it may be my way. Yeah. But it's not the only way.
And I think that goes to, that's interesting. So the pairing with that I find really kind of powerful is you then say, at the heart of the thrust then of the, not the nature, but the function of the church is liberation.
Right.
That it's, and you make a very, I'm paraphrasing you here, but you said, if it moves anywhere other than the primary function, then it's possible that we can cut it out and say it's not as necessary. And you say liberation is the number one function of the church.
Yeah. When you look at the context under which this kind of ecclesial sensibility emerges. Right. It really does emerge. First of all, we understand this emerges under the context of empire. Okay.
The church itself.
The church itself. And what the church represents as a threat to empire is that it represents a free zone. It represents a zone where freedom actually happens. And as such, it becomes the core. It becomes the core, of what the church is and where the church is going. We can see today that if liberation is not at the core of it, what separates it? Even Bart said this. What separates us from being a social club? If it's just getting together on Sunday mornings and listening to a nice speech and then having donuts and coffee afterwards, we actually don't even need Jesus for that.
Right.
Jesus does not have to be at the center of ecclesiology. But because we, especially as Protestants, believe that in essence the church is the body of Christ and that the church embodies Christ in its own special way. Yeah. And if you take Ernst Käsemann's classic title of his book, Jesus Means Freedom, if that's the case, then that's what we have to be about. And this freedom occurs in a lot of different ways for people. There are people who continually come to the church to be set free from certain kinds of bondage, to experience and to hear these stories of freedom and liberation that's going to help them in their fundamental ways. And I think that where the church fails is where it stops preaching that. When it stops preaching that is when the church really fails to be what it's called to be.
But you're also really clear to say, to the extent that the function of the liberation of the church is tied up in the need for salvation from sin, it cannot just be the individual seeking freedom from bondage. We have to go back out to society. It's a dual kind of focus.
Right. Sin is social. And this all comes from the African understanding of sin as that which ruptures community. Okay. And so sin is social in the African American understanding of sin. It is not the breaking of individual moral rules without understanding those rules set in a much broader context. And so while sometimes we focus on these, whether or not you should play cards or whether or not you should dice, individually it doesn't make sense. But when you pan back and you understand, for example, what gambling addiction does to families, communities, the sin is what happens to that community.
So then, right. So the kind of the norming norm is the whole healthy community.
Right. Yeah. And so that's what defines sin. So one of the points of tension between African American understanding of sin and the sort of understandings of sin that have sort of emerged from Western sort of philosophical and moral thought has been around that, and primarily around sex. So, anything that involves sexuality is sin. But that's why we have to kind of go back and look at what are the things that damage community for us. And so where I talk about sin is not to be read or understood as a sort of final proclamation of what sin is for everybody. But it is a contribution to the overall conversation about sin from an African American perspective, and in particular because African Americans and Africans in the diaspora have been tarred, and I mean that in a literal way, have been tarred with the stigma of sin.
Yeah.
So I talk about the way sin and blackness have been associated.
Right.
Okay. So sin for a people coming out of that experience is never connected with what you do. It's connected with who you are. To give our listeners a contemporary example, one of the reasons, and I'm also been sort of an amateur political scientist since college days, that I'm really interested in politics. But I've been very much interested over the last 7.5 years. One, in that the president symbolizes a presence in the White House that has not been part of American experience, and that the reaction to him has been highly personalized. It is not about his policies. It's not about what he does. It's about who he is. And we can see that being played out in the politics today. So President Barack Obama, as a black man, suffers under that same weight of the association of sin with his being and not with anything that he does. He doesn't have to do anything. Some people are upset because he is. And so I think that represents this kind of ongoing battle that we continue to struggle with in terms of really understanding sin as a kind of rupture in relationships.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you make the point through several kind of doctrinal categories that, and including in your afterword, I thought this was really interesting. There are some claims maybe made, over the past couple of decades that maybe kind of racism is kind of an essential category in the philosophical sense.
Right.
And you said, no. Right. It's not that racists are essentially a thing, or that races even are essentially a thing. However, the social function of racism must be named as against the will of God.
Right. And that's a learning that I came to through maturity, through conversations with some other.
So what would the young version of you had said?
Well, the young version of me would have said that race is more essential to who I am as an individual.
That your blackness is
my
who
blackness,
you are.
that's the thing, and and I will tolerate no challenge to that. But in my maturity, I understand that what we constitute as blackness has been very dynamic over time. It's dynamic in different cultures. And my travels to other places help me understand this. That blackness takes different shapes and forms in different cultural contexts. It is just that the context in which it takes shape in the United States is so powerful. Okay, so but it's not the only way it takes place. The other thing is that we need not be confined by binary categories. That I need to always claim that I can be black and human at the same time. And that's where when I get to the chapter on humanity, it's called On Being Black. And how can I answer this question of I can't answer the question of being human in this context without dealing with the question of being black. I can't do it.
Right.
But it does not mean that my humanity itself is inaccessible.
Right.
So, that's something that I kind of have come to over the last couple of
that's
days.
a really interesting, I want to just flesh it out a little bit. It's really interesting. The same move that you made earlier when we were talking about kind of doctrine of God regarding the necessity of experience being key happens here again. You're not saying that there's some kind of essence to your humanity that is blackness, but if we're going to talk about you and your humanity, we have to talk about your blackness.
We have to.
Right. But that's because of our experience, not because of the category of human.
Right. It's because of a whole history of experience in which the bonds of humanity have been attenuated and finally shattered and broken over a misunderstanding of humanity and
who counts as human.
And who counts as human. And so, so you have to talk about it.
Right.
It doesn't mean at the end of the day that you won't find some deep common humanity. And I'm firmly convinced that we can get to this deep common humanity, that we can get there. If I were not convinced of that, then I think I would have no interest in communicating with people who did not share my experience. I would have no interest. At the end of the day, you have no interest in writing anything.
Right. What's the point? Right.
What's the point? I do believe that we can get there. History has given us too many exceptions to the rule of racism. Whether it's Viola Liuzzi and the civil rights movement, a white woman from Detroit who, without any history of involvement in the civil rights movement, decided that she was going to go south and help black people register to vote and ended up giving her life for it. Many unnamed people who did not necessarily have a personal stake, whether it was Bonhoeffer, did not have a personal stake in the experience of others, but who felt so powerfully connected that they saw themselves deeply in other people. So there are those experiences, and to me, those are the glimpses that God wants to show us about being human. Miss Louise did not give up being an Italian American woman.
Right.
She was always that.
Right.
But she saw something through that. She saw something that connected her to this group of people whose experiences she did not directly share.
Yeah, and that's an interesting. I mean, one of the kind of how would I say this? The kind of implications of the way that you frame the theological anthropology actually has, I think, a very significant social bearing. So, for example, a younger version of me, since we're going back in time, kind of in my attempts to be kind of a socially progressive or liberal, and not just kind of an embarrassing moment, but like there were some people, I wanted people to say, oh, you're such a black white guy.
Right.
I wanted people to say that because like what I cared about was fitting in with a group of people that made more sense to me. Right. What I've kind of, much more maturing to do, but it's like, that's not really, I can't be black.
Right.
And to really be doing the right thing, I need to have my whiteness be liberatory on its own merit. I can't skip out of my category.
Right.
And I think what's interesting about the way that you do the anthropology here is to say, look, a full humanity, will that be everyone being everyone?
Sure.
Here.
Right.
And that's what kind of the tie into the eschatological question is that it has to be here.
Right.
I mean, it's not that there isn't some kind of second coming that's a millennial version of it, but it drives our Christian ethics in the present.
Right.
I need to be me, being bound up with liberation. I don't get to opt out somehow by being blackish. Right. It doesn't happen. But we see it, especially I think a lot of activism, kind of white progressives don't always know what to do.
Right.
And they want to, they said, no, we are, for those of us that are white, we are white.
Right.
And solidarity is a real gesture here.
Sure.
Not pretending to be something else.
Right. And there was a text that I read many years ago. It was called Refusing to Be a Man by a man named Stoltenberg. And it was about him as trying to be the sort of male feminist.
Yeah.
So he was going to reject his own maleness, and discovered that you can't do that.
Turns out.
So I can be in solidarity with my sisters.
Yeah.
But there's no reason for me to say that I'm going to refuse to be a man, because if I do that, what I simply do is hide my privilege even deeper. And so, as a man, I have privilege. Mm-hmm. Okay, even as a black man in a racist world, I still have some privilege.
Sure.
Over women. Okay, yeah. And so I need to really always be aware of that. Always look for ways to intentionally resist where possible.
Right.
Using that privilege in ways that benefit me and harm the life chances for my sisters.
Right.
And that's really all you can do.
Yeah. And and that's what's interesting is that the call for kind of a liberatory and just world is not merely on the basis of, I don't know, the Beatitudes or the dictations in the Gospels, but actually the fulfillment of the church, the fulfillment of Christ in the eschaton can actually be practiced in the present.
Right.
While we have fleshly bodies and we vote and we buy things, let's do that in a way that is liberatory or contributing to liberation.
Right. And it has to do also with, and you hear it in today in the sort of rejection of so-called diversity and these kinds of things. We have to understand that, and I use this as a title for a presentation. It's called God Makes the Difference. And the differences between us are part of God's plan as well. So those differences are not to be erased. They are to be explored. They are our avenues to come to true community. And this is seen in the educational philosophy of some of our major colleges and universities. When I dropped my oldest son off at Harvard for his freshman year, the assistant dean called all the freshman class together after they had put their stuff away, and he said, "Look around." And he said, there are people here from every walk of life, from every state of the union, from half of the nations on earth. They come from urban environments, rural environments. They come from, northern and southern environments, because we believe that this is an authentic context for you to really discover who you are. And so when we find today this sort of resistance or this rejection of an embrace of the variety that kind of marks our way of getting at being human, then what we're really talking about is the preservation of hegemony.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're really talking about. And so that's why I wrote the book, to be read in conversation with theologies from, whether it's Veen Delorier or any of my Latina sisters, is to be read in conversation with them, so that the student can have multiple conversation partners. In terms of getting at this.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting in terms of God being the difference. We see the resistance to that on at least two fronts. Right, on the conservative front, we have the kind of neo-nationalism that's on the rise with the conservative right. But there's also, and I think an unintentional, and I imagine you encounter this having taught in a seminary for years, it also persists in a kind of neoliberalism regarding, I'm colorblind.
Yes.
I don't see difference. Well, then you just get to hold on to your privilege.
Right. And that in some ways can be more dangerous, because you have good intentions covering up bad results.
Yeah, right.
And so in some ways that can be more dangerous.
That's interesting.
But I think you're absolutely right. They all end up at the same place. One simply is sort of in your face hegemony. The other one is hidden. I don't claim it. But I do think at the end of the day, our differences are avenues to our commonality. They are not the goal of our inquiry. Our goal of our inquiry is not for me to discover that I am a unique individual, although I may be. At the end of the day, the goal is to find ways in which I am connected to everyone else. I mean, that's, fellowship.
Yeah.
Koinonia. That's really what the church really should be trying to embody.
Yeah.
That it's really not about just us finding ourselves as individuals.
Yeah. Well, and it's really interesting. There's a marked quality, both-bandedness quality to kind of your thinking. I was just sitting here thinking, that is the case, right? That the koinonia call is a pretty profound and echoing call in your work. And at the same time, you say, your story is your story.
Sure.
And your people's story is your people's story. There's a particularity to it.
Right.
But what your claim is the particularity announces the kind of the inception of the universal, as opposed to being exactly one-to-one with it or something like that.
Right. It's an avenue. It's a road that you walk, but it allows you not to have to make this choice between embracing who I am, who I was created to be, in all of my particularity, and still embracing the fact that I am part of this genre called human beings. That I'm one of that. And see, this is what I find when I've been doing some study on sort of megachurch phenomena and the way in which many African Americans find the kind of attractiveness in that. And one of the reasons that such places are attractive to many African Americans is that in their minds, they feel that such places don't force them to really embrace their own blackness. Now, see, here's the problem. That if I see the particularity of my own created embodied being as a limitation, as something that's going to block my ability to communicate with other human beings, then I'm going to try to find a way to reject it, to move it. And so I've heard many people in their own pain talk about, don't call me black, I'm not that. I'm an American. Don't call me black, I'm a human being. I understand the pain out of which that comes. That comes out of the pain of having the thing that particularly identifies you described as a limitation. Something that prohibits your participation in the common human family. And so I understand where that pain comes from. But we need to be retaught.
Yeah. Right, because you flip that on its head and say, look, you're not going to deny that we live in a society where power is mediated through racist structures. Right. So you say, you're not the problem.
That's right.
The problem is the structure.
The structure is the problem. Right. And that's why, in another book I wrote, I spent a lot of time talking about what W.B. Du Bois and others call the Negro problem. And Du Bois talks about how does it feel to be a problem? And in his exploration of that, the fact is that the Negro is not the problem per se, but the problematic character of American experience has been imposed on the Negro. It's like what Chris Rock said at the in his kind of lead up to the Oscars, I believe. Yeah. And he said, people say to me, boy, black people have come so far. And he said, no, we haven't. You have. He said, because we've always known. He said, we've always known that we're worthwhile human beings. You've been slow to come and recognize that. So, I think you have to understand that racism has casualties. Yeah. That 400 years of slavery and racial oppression has created what Brian Davies calls psychological damage. And part of that psychological damage is expressed in self-hatred. Yeah.
And in the white context, well, first of all, right, so even the phrase the white context is already skewed by power, right? As if whiteness is one thing, right? That's part of the echo of the hegemony. But within the various kind of ethnicities that make up what it is that kind of the category of whiteness is, the other, when people grapple with that, I think one of the things that your theological work is calling Christians to say is we can't rest in self-hatred if we identify with a marginalized or oppressed class. Yeah. Neither can we rest in a sense of kind of profound guilt as a part of the oppressing class. Right. We need to figure out a way to be church together.
Right. Yeah.
And that church is going to be a church that makes the world better for all of our children.
Well, because I think in that context, the church needs to be a zone where both repentance and forgiveness are plentifully expressed.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
And I see part of the problem that we have being church, and, people quote this quote by, I guess, Liston Pope, that 11 o'clock on Sunday is the most segregated hour in America. And why is that the case? Why is that even now, for the most part, we are divided by race along these ecclesial lines? Well, one reason for that in my mind is that on one hand, one group is called upon to be forgiving, but the other group does not repent. And for the health to be there, for me to forgive, and sometimes I believe this is necessary now, that I forgive without depending on the repentance of the one who has harmed me.
Yeah.
But that just allows me to go on living. It does not create any kind of fellowship with the other. Because if you don't have that repentance, then you have not put yourself out there to be part of it. So I think the American church today is still challenged by the task of being a zone where both forgiveness and repentance are freely embraced. And today we really don't have that.
Yeah, and so we can kind of wanted to draw us to a close, but this is actually a really good place to go, because I think it's really important I know it's been important to you, but I also think it's important for people to hear that over the course of your entire career as an academic, you nevertheless stopped serving the church in a pastoral role.
Right.
And that is a key part of your thinking.
Well, it's a key part of my formation. And I think I would want your listeners to know that while I was working on my PhD at Union Seminary, I was also an associate pastor at a small African American church in a Latino neighborhood on the east side of Manhattan. So every day I took public transportation up 125th Street from the west side where Union was to the East River where the church was. I encountered two different realities. But I became a theologian on the bus ride, and I tell people that. I became a theologian. The ideas that I encountered at Union Columbia, now I had to kind of make sense of those ideas in light of the problems of 123rd between 2nd and 3rd.
Yeah.
The problems that I encountered at 123rd between 2nd and 3rd, I had to now bring with me and to see whether or not any of these ideological resources could be brought to bear to help me really understand how those happen. So I have always, I guess, both literally and figuratively done theology between the academy and the sanctuary. I mean, always. Yeah. And for the last 15 to 16 years, I've been the pastor of a church here in Rochester, and so we never really, and even when I wasn't a pastor, I was always connected with the church. I mean, I attended church every Sunday when I could. So, and a lot of that comes from me being fifth generation minister. I just can't go with that.
But it is interesting, right? I mean, there are certainly folks who kind of think about the work of I'm talking about academic theology here as somehow certainly ontologically tied up with the church, but maybe not practically on a week-to-week basis.
Absolutely. I've had colleagues who never went to church. There are still colleagues who are writing about the black church, but who never go. And for me, there is a issue, one, of intellectual honesty. One of the things that I learned from reading cultural anthropologists, because I find their methodologies oftentimes to be very helpful, is that cultural anthropologists would go sit in a community and simply observe. They would observe before they reach conclusions. They tried to understand how this community actually worked, what its meaning was, its systems of meanings, and how they were generated and interacted. To think that you can understand, first of all, black life without understanding the black church, I think is is certainly misguided.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, there is this sort of residue of the Enlightenment that says that anything that has to do with religion can never be connected to pure reason, to use Kant's phrase. So that if I can't be a true academic, to be a true academic is for me to reside solely in the life of the mind. Mm. Now, I love the life of the mind, but I also understand that the most powerful ideas come from a deep place of personal conviction. Mm-hmm. This is when ideas become revolutionary. When you think about through the history of Western philosophical thought, Western scientific thought, that ideas that are truly revolutionary are ideas that take such deep roots in the heart of the person who carries the idea that they're willing to give up anything for it, even die for it.
Right.
Okay.
And that's necessarily not, quote, just rational.
That's not just rational. It's the difference between Bonhoeffer and some other prominent German theologians of his day. Mm-hmm. The idea of radical discipleship for Bonhoeffer took such deep roots in his own psyche that even the boundaries of his rational considerations were no match for this powerful, deeply rooted idea of radical discipleship.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, that I think there's a way in which you really honor the wisdom of folk. So, for example, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright writes in here at the end. He says, "I've taught this book to people who don't even have a college degree, don't even have a high school education.
Right.
And I have to imagine that makes you very happy.
Yeah.
Right. That this book, and because what you're honoring is the black church. You're trying to show the black church back to itself descriptively, but then also say, and this is what we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And the reason you have the authority to say that isn't really because of your going to Union or studying at the feet of Cone, or that's not why. Right. It's because you're part of it. That's the authority. The how of it is going to Union and studying and stuff. And I think that that's a very interesting position for a theologian to be in. To say the reason I'm able to say this isn't because of all my learning, but because of who I am and what my experiences are and what community I come from.
Right.
The learning is just a tool.
Right. And because a theologian exists, as Tillich says, on the boundary. Okay. There's a way in which you have to have enough critical distance.
Sure.
From the church to understand when it's not being true to itself.
Yeah.
And to call it back to itself. But you are never so separated from it.
Yeah. That's good. So, folks, the book is We Have Been Believers in African American Systematic Theology. It's in its second edition in Fortress, and you should keep your eyes out. There's going to be a Bible commentary that you'll be seeing from Dr. Evans soon. Some essays around the Back to Africa movement, which is fascinating, and then particularly of interest this Gospel of Motown.
Right.
You're a native Detroit son. And so thinking about the ways in which the arts and that music has shaped the American kind of imagination about what it means to have the gospel be around, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thanks so much.
Callid, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
It's been a blast.
Okay, It's been wonderful.
This podcast is sponsored by Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a theological school that offers Christian education in service of intelligent, just, and compassionate religious and civic communities. They welcome students to a safe space for truth-seeking conversation about the Bible, Jesus, and faithful living. They have on-campus and distance learning options. Go check them out at www.wherefaithleads.com.